quite important. Here in the United States, we saw the beginnings of the oil industry back in the late 1850s, the first commercial oil well in Pennsylvania. For decades, the United States was the world's foremost, not only oil producing nation, but the world's foremost oil exporting nation. During World War II, 7 out of 8 barrels of oil burned by the Allies came from oil wells in Texas and Oklahoma, Southern California. So we've had more experience with oil in this country than any place else in the world. And part of our experience is we know what it's like to run out. Well, not run out completely. The US is still producing oil and will still be producing oil decades from now, but not like we were in the old days, the Beverly Hillbillies days of the 1960s and early 1970s. At that time, the US was producing over 10 million barrels a day of oil. But discoveries of oil, these vertical green bars, discoveries of oil in the US have been declining since the early 1930s. So we're just not finding oil the way we were. And production of oil in the US hit a peak around 1970 and has generally been declining since then. Of course, discoveries in Alaska made a big difference in the 1970s and early 80s. Then there was the Gulf of Mexico, and now we're working on North Dakota. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. For the world as a whole, discoveries have been declining since the early 1960s. So it's clear that the oil industry is changing, and it's changing very rapidly. World oil production, very often official agencies lump in all kinds of liquid fuels together with oil, so it's hard to tell what's going on. They'll lump in biofuels and natural gas liquids like butane and propane, which we don't use for transportation, refinery gains and all these other things. But if you extract all of those other categories and just look at regular crude oil, the world is producing about the same amount today as it was in 2005. Now that's strange because up until 2005, world oil production had been inexorably growing year after year after year by about 3% per year. So what's happened since 2005? Is it just that people don't want oil anymore? Well, if that were the case, why would we be paying $100 a barrel or $4 a gallon for gasoline? If we had plenty, the price should be lower, right? Well, in fact, there's plenty of demand for oil, especially in places like China. You know, the Chinese are buying 16 million cars a year right now. The American car market currently is about 15 million cars a year. So the Chinese car market is bigger than the US car market. So Chinese demand for oil is exploding. China's oil imports right now are running at a faster pace than US oil imports. And that's remarkable. I mean, for many, many years, the US has been the world's foremost oil importing nation. There are other ways in which the oil business has changed. This is what it used to look like back in the old days. This is what it looks like today. We have to search for oil in very inconvenient places, like in ultra deep water, under miles of ocean water, or with the tar sands of Alberta, Canada, where what we're doing is basically a mining operation, mining bitumen, this sticky, gooey stuff that then has to be refined into oil using enormous amounts of energy. This is the relationship between oil prices and the economy. Now, the squiggly line, of course, is the oil price adjusted for inflation. These are 2008 dollars. And the vertical gray bars are recessions going back to 1970. Every time we've had an oil price spike, we've had a recession. Very close relationship there. Well, what happened in 2008? We had the biggest oil price spike in history, up to $150 a barrel. And very soon the economy went into a tailspin. Of course, that's not the only reason the economy faltered in 2008. Of course, we had a housing bubble that burst, but the trigger for that crisis was, in many respects, the price of oil. Why so? Well, where did the housing crisis really hit first? It was in the far distant suburbs. People, house prices had been bid up and up and up, so people were moving further and further out into more and more distant suburbs. So they had to commute longer and longer distances, right? And when the price of oil went up, the price of gasoline went up, that made commuting more and more expensive. People often found themselves in a situation where they couldn't afford both to pay their mortgage and to pay the gasoline bill on their credit card. So part of what we're seeing right now is persistent high oil prices. Now, with oil price spikes in the past, these have been transitory, and the price of oil has gone back down again. Now, yes, the price of oil is not where it was in 2008. It was up to $150. But right now, on the international market, oil is selling for about $110 a barrel. That's about 4 times what it was 10 years ago in inflation-adjusted terms. So that's a huge drag on economic activity for the world as a whole, and particularly for the older industrialized countries like the United States and Europe. Now, why is oil so expensive? Is it because there are speculators on Wall Street who are, driving up the prices? Well, if that were the case, it would be an easy fix. But unfortunately, it's not so simple. It's just gotten more expensive to explore for and produce oil. Remember the slide of the big Deepwater Horizon oil rig? Well, it can cost up to $500 million to drill an exploratory well in ultra-deep water. And so unless the oil price is up around $100 a barrel, it's just not cost effective for the industry to go out and look for new sources. Meanwhile, when oil prices are that high, they're a drag on the economy. So it's a situation where something has to give. Now, we are having a little more luck looking for oil in this country these days. You've probably read about oil production in the Bakken field in North Dakota. There's also the Eagle Ford play in South Texas. We're applying new technology, hydrofracturing or fracking, to produce oil from tight reservoirs. These are reservoirs that geologists have known about for a long time, but they wouldn't drill them because you'd send a drill bit down and basically you'd get a little plume of production from the rock right around the well bore, and that was it. Because the rock was just so impermeable. It was not porous, so it didn't allow the oil or natural gas to migrate to the well bore. Well, now with hydrofracturing and horizontal drilling, there's technology to access more of that oil, but it's expensive technology. Again, unless oil prices are up in the range of $100 a barrel, it doesn't really pay to go looking for this stuff. But there are other problems with hydrofracturing. Even though we have this fancy new technology, the rock itself hasn't changed. So it requires very high rates of drilling. Each well has a very high, I'll get back to these in just a moment, very high decline rate. You drill a well in January, and by December, the rate of production from that well has already fallen by maybe 60–70%. So in order to keep production flat from a large field of wells, or to increase production, that means you have to drill and drill and drill. So far, the oil and gas industry has drilled something like 60,000 wells in the United States just in the last few years. Let's go back to this slide because it tells the story. Even though U.S. oil production has only ticked up a little bit, drilling has increased dramatically. So if we want this current little spate of increased oil production to continue, that means we're going to have to drill a lot more in the years ahead. I have this website up here because this is my organization, Post Carbon Institute, has just produced a report on shale gas and tight oil, and you can access that report on this website. It's a free PDF download. It's the most thorough analysis of the data on shale gas and tight oil that has been done to date, including work by the US Department of Energy and the International Energy Agency. We looked at 63,000 wells and looked at their initial production rates, their decline rates, and so on. And what we found was that even though there are shale plays in a number of places in the United States, within each play there are only small sweet spots where production can occur profitably. So even though the resource base is very large, and often you'll read or hear about the US having 100 years of cheap natural gas as a result of fracking, or decades of high rates of oil production from North Dakota. Well, that's only seemingly true if you take the initial production rates from those sweet spots and extrapolate that to the entire resource base. But our research shows that that's unrealistic. Most of the resource base is going to be uneconomic to produce, or will be produced only very slowly. And again, all of this is going to require very, very high rates of expensive drilling. So don't believe the hype that the United States is in the early phase of an energy bonanza. What we're actually seeing is the last gasp of a desperate industry. Taking into account the number of drilling locations that are possible in the Bakken and the Eagle Ford. This is just tight oil here. This isn't the shale gas. It's a different decline curve in that case. But just for tight oil, we foresee a peak and rapid decline in production around 2017. So not many years from now for the United States. I don't know how well you can see this back there. This is the Barnett Play in central Texas. It's right around Fort Worth, Texas. Actually, you can see the town of Fort Worth, Texas, right there on the map, and hundreds and hundreds of shale gas, mostly gas wells, right around Fort Worth. The black dots are the sweet spots. Those are the places that are producing profitably, and the red dots are shale gas wells that are producing, and they're actually losing money on production with every cubic foot of natural gas that comes out of the ground.
Do you want to